Hello everybody, my name is Mitch and today we are talking tips for fantasy football drafting. If you like fantasy football, hit the subscribe button because this channel does post fantasy football content. Alright, getting started here. The first thing I'm calling who, what, and when. Starting with the who. For me, that means know who you're drafting with. Some people like certain players, some people have certain draft styles. Folks that really like wide receivers. I've known folks that draft a bunch of quarterbacks or a bunch of tight ends. I'm in the Midwest, so teams like the Chiefs, the Vikings, the Packers, players like that are sought out. Aaron Rodgers, Pat Mahomes. I do feel like where I'm from, they go a little higher than I see the average draft pick predict. I'm interested to see where Najee Harris goes if you are drafting in Pittsburgh, for instance, versus Nick Chubb. It never hurts to consider who you are drafting with. For the next tip, you definitely need to know what type of fantasy football you are playing. Some have 2 quarterbacks, 3 wide receivers. What I'm going to focus on here is standard versus PPR. I have the top PPR running backs for the 2020 league, and then I'll show the standard side. We have Alvin Kamara, Dalvin Cook, Derrick Henry, David Montgomery. Just in the top 4, you see the difference. Derrick Henry is up to number 1, Kamara number 2. And as you go down the list, it's just going to change more and more. In fact, on the wide receiver, the top 3 kind of stay the same. DeAndre Hopkins is notable in PPR. He is much higher ranked. I think he's like 10 or 11 in the standard, you'll see. On the top, it kind of stays the same, but then as you go down, it's just a huge difference. Very important to know what kind of fantasy football league you're drafting in. There are some players that will do better in standard and some that will do better in PPR. That's not to say that some players are only good in standard or PPR, although maybe in some extreme scenarios that could be true, but just be careful about your drafting and know what kind of fantasy football league you are drafting for. Next, we have know when your draft is going to be. This is kind of a silly tip, but I can't tell you how many times I've heard about drafts or I've been a part of drafts where someone is auto-drafting for some, if not all, of the draft. They sign up for a league ahead of time, and then when it's draft day, they forget about it or they have something else scheduled, and then they have to auto-draft through the league. Auto-drafting isn't always the worst case scenario, but it is probably better if you're drafting on your own and making your own decisions. If an injury happens or if there's an update in the real world that the app hasn't acknowledged yet, whatever drafting app you use, then that will cause your auto draft to do something that you might not like so much. Here I use the ESPN app to do an auto draft for me, and you can see it's not the worst thing in the world. It did go ahead and pick Tyreek Hill and Nick Chubb. I think personally, when it did that, I noticed I probably would have taken Austin Eckler into Nick Chubb, but that's just personal for me, and just a good example of the auto draft isn't always going to do necessarily what you would have preferred. Chances are it will do something completely different, especially when it comes to the players it grabs on your bench, your tight end, your quarterback. Who knows? Again, it might not be the worst thing in the world, but definitely know when your draft is so you can avoid auto drafting. The next tip is to be careful about your bye weeks. Try not to draft players that all have the bye week at the same time, because it will be tough for you to get that win that week if all your players are on the bench because they have their bye week. And I know there can be some train of thought that is like, well, at least I have those players for every other week. If you want to forfeit a week, I guess that's fine. I feel like every week counts, especially if you're playing in leagues that give maybe side prizes for overall record or overall points, things like that. Then you definitely want to be competing and being competitive every single week. Here are the bye weeks for the 2021 season. For example, if you look at week 13, for instance, let's say you had Christian McCaffrey, you had Devontae Adams, Nick Chubb, and Derrick Henry. An amazing team, a team that's so good you probably would not have that team. You'd probably still lose week 13 just because all of their bye weeks would lie on the same week. So there's an example of the bye weeks being important. Just be careful about them. Most of the apps that you guys will use to draft will show your bye weeks of the players that you're drafting and the ones that you can draft, because it is important. Just look out for that. Be careful about bye weeks. My next tip is to pay attention to football news. You never know when something can happen that will drastically change someone's value. I like to use the Sleeper Fantasy Football app, but there are all sorts of sources everywhere, online, anywhere, that will give you fantasy football news, regular football news, just so that you can be on top of your current football knowledge to help with your fantasy football drafts. A very good example of this is recently, unfortunately, Cam Akers. He had an injury and he is going to be out for the season. A lot of the times these things aren't updated on the apps you guys are going to use to draft your fantasy football teams, and you could end up drafting a player whose value has drastically dropped for some reason or another. On the flip side, there could be players whose values have increased because of reasons relating to football news, and you can be ahead of the game in that way and help enhance your draft and your fantasy football team. My next tip is kickers and defenses last. I mean, this is one that I'm kind of a stickler on. I will probably fill out my entire bench before I start grabbing kickers and defenses. For me, there has to be like not a single player in the flex position that I even recognize anymore for me to start grabbing kickers and defenses before my last picks. I suppose there's a chance that you grab a kicker or a defense that is literally going to carry you through the league, but I really feel like you'll get bigger bang for your buck and better chances of success if you just draft flex options, backup tight ends, even a backup running back, or just sleeper options that you want to take a chance on. I think that those can be much more valuable than trying to snag like the best defense or the best kicker. Personally, I just think it's a waste of a pick. I save kicker and defense for my last two picks generally. For the last tip, make sure you guys are doing mock drafts. You can set up a mock draft or find a mock draft to match the exact amount of people, the exact type of scoring. A lot of the times commissioners will tell people the pick that they're going to have ahead of time, so then you can even mimic the pick that you're going to get and really just try to create what your draft experience is going to be like, and obviously that's going to be good practice for you. So I do encourage you to do mock drafts. I'll show you an example here. You just Google ESPN fantasy football. We'll go to mock draft lobby, and then here you see a bunch of different drafts, and you literally just pick one. Make sure you guys are doing mock drafts. I think they're super helpful. I feel like they help me a lot and really make sure that I'm confident when I go into the draft that I have some sort of a clue of what's going on. But anyway, those are all the tips I have for now. Good luck on all of your guys' drafts. Let's make sure we all have great fantasy football seasons this year. Peace out.